Welcome back everyone to the TrueChampionSteven channel. My name is Steve Rodriguez and today we're talking about Oracle Think Tank versus Kagero. Let's get started. As some of you may know, we have a brand new series here on the channel called Know Your Matchups, where I try to answer the various matchup questions that you guys have for me. For example, Royal Paladin versus Kagero was last week's episode. Today though, we're going to be tackling Oracle Think Tank versus Kagero. Pretty tough matchup to talk about, but like all matchups, I feel like as long as you guys have the general information about what each deck can do, against the other one that is very advantageous in the matchup, you definitely have enough information to tackle it yourself in the future, which is what this series is all about. If you guys are unfamiliar with this series, basically I try to go through all the pertinent information that these kinds of matchups or particular decks have, so that way you guys can be better prepared for if you ever face with this matchup in the future. For example, last week I also did an episode called How to Beat Stall. There might be some one-sided episodes where all I do is try to talk about one particular deck, if a particular deck is like dominating a format, for example. So if you guys have any similar kinds of questions or just want to ask me anything about the Cardfight Vanguard or Pokemon TCG, don't be afraid to leave them down in the comments below, or join our Discord server where we have specific text channels specialized for this series called Know Your Matchups Pokemon and Know Your Matchups Cardfight Vanguard. Don't be afraid to ask me questions down in those text chats. I always do my best to answer them as fast as I possibly can, or hey, maybe even other members of the True Squad can answer them for you, so that way I have to do less work. But also, don't be afraid to ask questions because they might be made into a video just like this one. But anywho, with all that being said, if you guys are brand new here and don't know at all who I am, my name is the TrueChampionSteven. I do all kinds of deck profiles, TCG meta discussions, or even just general TCG tips and knowledge like this video. So if you guys are interested in anything like that and becoming your very own true champion, why not hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell for notifications so that way you guys know when my videos go live for you. And now with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with Oracle Think Tank versus Kagero. So for this video, I'm going to be covering three major things. Number one is kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each deck, kind of like a fact check of each one, you know, what they do, what their kind of general game plan is, what their win cons generally are. That's what I'm going to be going over in the first part. The second part, I'm going to be trying to figure out what the boss units are for this deck. And yes, I'm going to be doing BTO5, so Tsukuyomi will be on this list, I promise. And then kind of what those boss units add to the general strengths and weaknesses and why the decks are centered around these cards. And then finally, I'm going to talk about kind of the general game flow between these two decks. You know, who should go first, who should go second, which markers you should use, what cards are really beneficial in the matchup, stuff like this. So that way you guys know kind of more or less what the opponent is trying to do turn by turn, because if you can figure out what your opponent wants to do on turn 5, that means on turn 2 you can prepare for it and make sure that it's less of a big deal for you in the long run, because ultimately, in my opinion, this matchup comes down to one thing: which deck can pressure the other one more, because they're both really good at gaining advantage, but which one can pressure more is the ultimate key here. And if you're ready for that said pressure, it's really no big deal. I'm always trying to preach here on the channel. I'm not trying to teach you guys what to think, I'm trying to teach you how to think about the card games that you play, so that way you can become better, not just listen to what I tell you and then you're just better. You know, that's not the same thing to me. Being a true champion means you know how to win versus someone just told you how to win. Does that make sense? I hope it does. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the strengths and weaknesses of each deck. Alright, so Kagero, the bread and butter of your boy here. I love Kagero. It's my favorite deck, the deck that I've played since the very beginning. What are its strengths and weaknesses? Number one, its major strength is that it is the pinnacle of card advantage. Not only does it gain a lot of cards through drawing effects, through restanding, or through just general pressure against the opponent by making them lose cards, it also retires the opponent's units. So it has board presence, hand advantage, and of course, general card advantage. Super amazing. And it wins through using this card advantage to then create pressure against the opponent by discarding them for effects like restands, or even getting restanding rear guards, and just having multiple attacks in a Force Clan. The inclusion of Force 2 allowed the deck to become even more aggressive than it used to be, which is super a big plus that I've been preaching for the longest time as its biggest trait right now, is that it's a really aggressive Force deck, which is super fun. And then finally, the last thing that it does is that it kind of can disrupt your opponent. You know, there's ways to play it kind of control-y-esque. It can dictate the game state very well of any game that it's in by attacking rear guards, gaining advantage, or even still counterblast negating your opponent, like starving them of counterblast, that way they can't use the effects that normally give them advantage. So this deck is really good at starving your opponent and gaining advantage because of that. Its main weakness, however, is that sometimes in late game, it's hard to generate cards. So late game card advantage is kind of non-existent. Once you get to the late game, if this deck isn't pressuring you, they're either losing or they're dead drawing because they can't do anything. You know, that stuff like that's happening. So once you get around turn 4 or 5, this deck tends to not become an advantage deck anymore. It becomes a strict pressure deck trying to win the game as fast as possible, because if it doesn't, all that advantage that it accumulated in the early turns is going to just slowly go away, because all of its effects discard things to create pressure, so it kind of can even out eventually, or even start going negative, which is bad. So long games aren't necessarily the best for Kagero right now, but there's ways to play around that kind of weakness. And then a weakness that it still has is that it's really hard to create pressuring rearguard columns with this deck. Like, unless you're on Force 1, it's really not scary, the columns they create. You know, they're 1-card guards. So sometimes being Force 2 is both good and bad, because if you're Force 2, you're doing more damage and you're pressuring your opponent more, sure, but since I'm Force 2, my rearguard columns aren't that strong, so it kind of actually is really no big deal. You know, my opponent still just uses 1 card to guard instead of 2, so they could have stopped 2 attacks for the price of 1 attack if I was still Force 1. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. The idea is that it creates pressure but doesn't create power. And then finally, the biggest weakness that I think Kagero has right now is that it still doesn't pressure enough. I mean, a deck like Oracle Think Tank, with all the cards that are in its hand, just laughs at Force 2. So even if I go for my most pressuring option of Force 2, unless I get super lucky and turn on my first Grade 3 ride, just wombo restand a Dragonic Over the end against my opponent, I'm not winning the game because I was super pressuring on Force 2. I'm winning the game through card advantage and steadily grinding out my opponent's hand by being Force 1. So it still really only has one avenue of play in my mind. That's like good for it. Now, if you want to wombo, go Force 2 and bang out some try and win with it, sure, you can still do that, and you can now, which is really fun, but it's not the most consistent thing in the world. Next up, we got Oracle Think Tank. Oracle Think Tank, number one selling point is that it draws cards like it's its job. All this deck does is draw cards, manipulate its top decks, and pluses out the wazoo. It is a strict advantage deck, and by creating so much advantage, it then uses effects like Promise Daughters, Rectangle Magus, other cards that stack triggers and then turns triggers into power, or turns cards into hands into power, to then create pressure. So its whole entire, deck scheme is built on advantage. If it has advantage, it's winning. Another thing is that it can create pressure. It can create pressure out of nowhere. So imagine your opponent goes Cure Magus, stack the top 2 cards. There's no triggers there. Say there's no triggers there. You're still on the other side fearing that trigger, so you guard. Like, they created pressure without even needing to create pressure. So the deck is very pressuring, very advantageous, very consistent, and of course has an outrageous win con called Victorious Deer and Tsukuyomi. Tsukuyomi can just gain so much power to the front row to the point where if they get double triggers, they just can force so much damage down your throat. And then they have Victorious Deer, which literally stacks 2 crits and gives the whole board plus 10k. That is an insane win con in its own right, and that's why Oracle Think Tank is such a powerful deck and a very tough matchup for Kagero. I'm already going to say right now, it's not a favorable matchup for Kagero, plain and simple, because the advantage that Oracle Think Tank generates is so hard for Overlord to, stamp out, that if I'm not constantly pressuring an Oracle Think Tank player, which is very rare to do, then I'm just not on the actual, front end of advantage. So the matchup is very hard, but it is very winnable, and I'll get to how in a minute. But the main weakness of Oracle Think Tank, and I've said this time and time again, it's not very resource stable. Like, its resources are limited and hard to find. Sure, it has Gemini, but no one plays Gemini anymore because they're so greedy and they want to maximize all their counterblasts and all the cards in their deck. And sometimes people can just go a little too hard sometimes. Like, if your opponent's at 3 damage and they have all that damage face down as Oracle Think Tank, you can just attack their rear guards for a whole turn, and then they're not doing anything. And then you can take that turn to then try and get more advantage back, and then hit back on the next turn. That's a really valid strategy in the middle of a game to try and get some advantage in the mid game that they could have easily gotten if they just weren't so aggressive with their counterblasts. So definitely a big plus for every other deck, and a big weakness for Oracle Think Tank is that they do not have good resource management right now, and they still don't. Sure, White Hair of Inaba, once it comes out, it's going to be really helpful for getting soul management, but still, it's not going to be the greatest thing in the world. Another big weakness that it has is it cannot handle multiple rearguard attacks. Being a major Protect 1 deck, Having just a bunch of PGs in your hand, sure, my hand is 10 cards, but I can really only stop 5 attacks over a certain number. You know, like that's what the idea you gotta think of is the number of cards in their hand may be cool, but how many attacks can they actually guard against? That's the real question you should be asking yourself, and if you can do like 8 attacks in turn, like an outrageous number, you're gonna win the game eventually. Anywho, that's kind of it for the strengths and weaknesses of each deck. Let's go ahead and move on to the boss units. Alright, so the boss units for Kagero, I explained this in the Royal Paladin versus Kagero matchup video. There's really only 3. There's Draconic Overlord at the end, Draconic Overlord the Great, and of course, Draconic Blade Master. For this matchup, however, I'm going to just get rid of Draconic Blade Master. He is not even worth considering in this matchup. Yes, you can guard restrict your opponent with that awesome grade 1, and yes, you can get multiple drive checks in a single turn with very pressuring rear guards, but Blade Master is not pressuring enough. They do not care if you retire their units. They even play Promise Daughter, so they can even get around your effects that make them multi-guard or make them only guard with trigger units. So it doesn't even matter. Get Blade Master out of your head. The 2 main ones to think of are Draconic Overlord the End and Draconic Overlord the Great. And once again, I have to side with the Great being the better option, but the End has some highlights as well that I'm going to say really quickly. So first, let's talk about Draconic Overlord the End and Draconic Overlord the Great. Draconic Overlord the End here, really powerful card, very aggressive card, like I've been saying. As early as your first grade 3 ride, if you ride him first, you can restand and attack your opponent. Say you went first, you played your hand down to 2 cards, and you went force 2, bada bing, bada boom. That could be the game ender right there. That's a big selling point for this card, and a really awesome thing that Oracle Think Tank needs to keep in mind. So this just hidden pressure thing that you have against them is actually a really big deal for the matchup, because now you can just steal games from Oracle Think Tank. Before, you could never do that. Oracle Think Tank almost always got to grade 3 against a Kagero player. They were never afraid. They always took damage, and they knew they couldn't die. Even if they let your Draconic Overlord hit, you know, you still couldn't kill them. But now we have the End. We have a guaranteed restander by flooding our board and being super aggressive. They've got to fear that. They've got to respect it, and they got to be able to deal with it somehow. And sometimes they can't. I will say he is best as Force 2 in that he attacks 3 times. And by attacking 3 times, he forces your opponent to guard 3 times if he has a crit, which if they're at 4 damage is very scary. Moving on, we got Draconic Overlord the Great here. Still my personal favorite option in any matchup playing Kagero, because he just gives you the most options, and he still pressures very well by having 5 force attacks if you have a Draconic Neoflame on the rear guard circle. I think in this matchup he is best as Force 1 because, like I said, you have a restanding rear guard, and one of the big weaknesses of Oracle Think Tank, like I mentioned earlier, was multi-attacks. So the more you can make your rear guard multi-attacks, the better you are, because it's not about killing them in like one turn. It's about getting as many cards out of their hand as possible as the turns go on. So if I attack my opponent 5 times, twice with a 30k Neoflame over 2 turns, that's a lot of cards out of their hand. I don't care how many PGs they have, they're not PGing all those attacks. And my Vanguard's attacking twice, getting multiple drive checks, and could even get a guaranteed crit if I want to be greedy and use Neoflame's Counterblast to effect. So I think he is strictly best as Force 1. But like I said before, say if you rode the End first and went Force 2 and tried to like wombo aggro your opponent's aggro your opponent in the early turns, that's more than fine. He can definitely work as Force 2 for sure, because being able to restand rear guards with crits, equally scary. So these are the main boss units for this matchup that I think you should definitely look at. They're clearly the best units in Kagero right now, and they're definitely worth considering playing a little bit differently in this matchup, because sometimes you don't think of Draconic Overlord as a multi-attacking card other than attacking twice as a Vanguard. I like to think of him as a rear guard attack more so than a Vanguard attack in this matchup, because they're almost always going to guard your Vanguard, but they don't always guard your rear guard. And when they're forced to guard a 40k or 30k rear guard twice, that's a lot of cards out of their hand that they didn't think they were supposed to save PGs for, and they're just dumping 15s or 20Ks for. That's a big deal. That adds up over time, trust me. So these are the 2. This is my personal favorite, but they're both really good, and they both add a lot to the deck that they didn't have before. Moving on, we're talking about the Oracle Think Tank boss units now, and again, there's really only 2 that I should mention. There's a bunch of grade 3s that are being used. There's Riley, there's Amaterasu, there's Deer. Those are all really good cards. There's Hexagonal Magus, there's Pentagonal Magus. There's that new Magus that's in BTO5 that I forget her name, but she's really good too. I'll put some pictures of them all here so that you guys can know what they look like. But the real 2 that are big deals are Imperial Daughter, which is the current boss for Oracle Think Tank, and of course, Tsukuyomi, the next boss for Oracle Think Tank. Let's talk about both of them and how they pertain to this matchup. I'm going to start first with Tsukuyomi. Personally, in this matchup, my least favorite one, because it's a very rear guard centric Oracle Think Tank deck. You front row gains 10k power, you stack your triggers, whoppy-doo, great. But it's inconsistent sometimes. You miss Tsukuyomi sometimes, which if you do, and that's your main grade 3, you can actually be behind on advantage in this matchup, which is a really bad thing. And then number 2, all your power goes to your rear guards, and your Vanguard really isn't that threatening. I know you have crits or whatever on top of your deck. I'm going to PG that, and then just take one of your rear guards, and then kill the rest of your rear guards, and now it's my turn. It's actually a kind of a weird dynamic that Tsukuyomi makes for this particular matchup, because a rear guard-centric deck does not scare Kagero. A Vanguard-centric deck that has a lot of advantage, that can survive the onslaught of whatever it is that I do as a Kagero player, that scares Kagero a lot more. So while yes, Tsukuyomi is a very objectively powerful card, and it's going to be the best deck for Oracle Think Tank when it comes out, no questions asked, I think a more hybrid build of Imperial Daughter or some other kind of backup grade 3 is going to be necessary, because I don't think Tsukuyomi by itself has a favorable Kagero matchup anymore, because it just doesn't do enough stuff against Kagero. I will say, in this matchup, as a Tsukuyomi player, you definitely want to go Protect 1 and not Protect 2. I almost think you never want to go Protect 2 unless you're fighting against an Excel deck. Moving on, we got Imperial Daughter, the current and my personal favorite boss unit for Oracle Think Tank. Quite specifically because this card does everything that Oracle Think Tank wants to do. It pluses cards, it adds resources to the soul, it can gain power to your rear guards, it can be a threat with a crit, and of course, it can stack your deck. This card is literally insane, and when it came out in set 1, it was a freaking big deal, and I hated it always playing against it. My friend Landed would always use this card against me, always get double crits, even though he didn't stack double crits, and I would lose, because I would have to take it, or I guarded for 2 to pass, because I was greedy, and I didn't think he stacked 2 cards. It gains advantage and then pressures your opponent, which is the whole idea of this matchup. Not only do you want to be constantly gaining your own advantage, you want to be trying to take away some of your opponent's advantage by pressuring them or getting rid of their rear guards or cards or resources like counterblasts. This card does that. Does it all. So I definitely think Imperial Daughter has a place in the future of Oracle Think Tank for sure as a backup boss. Yes, objectively Tsukuyomi is more powerful and a great way to build your deck, but Imperial Daughter is a better boss unit. So those are the main boss units. Once again, I think Imperial Daughter should be Protect 1 and Protect 2 only in Excel matchups, which this is not. So Protect 1 is the best one, I think, for this matchup for obvious reasons. With all that being said, I think these 2 cards are, one's really good against Kagero, the other one's not as good as I think people think against Kagero. So there's much to do there, but ultimately it is your choice how you build your Oracle Think Tank deck. Both these cards can beat Kagero, and both these cards still have quote-unquote favorable matchups against Kagero. One less so than the other, but whatever. Moving on, we're going to talk about the general game flow for how this matchup tends to go. Alright, so generally speaking, the game flow for this matchup, I think, goes as thus. Both players want to go first. Doesn't matter which deck you're playing, going first is by far the better option. However, if you're going second as a Kagero player, you have Sable Dragonute, which does force a card out of your opponent's hand if they choose to guard it, which is already great. And if they don't guard it, you already get an automatic +1. Super huge. So for Kagero, you really do have any option you like. So if you're stuck with going second, you actually have a really good option to pressure your opponent because of that. For Oracle Think Tank, not so much. Moving on to grade 2, we have amazing grade 2 rides in both the decks as both Berserk Dragon or Full Honor Dragon Buster, and we have Promise Daughter, no, sorry, not Promise Daughter, Maiden of Libra is pretty pressuring, as well as Rectangle Magus, and being able to like stack your deck with Cure and other things. You can have a very aggressive turn 2. Like you can have a really aggressive turn 2 as Oracle Think Tank if you choose to, which in this matchup I would not blame you for doing. However, I think it's a little too much resource sacrifice to be warranted. Like, I think it costs a little too much. It's a bit of a neg for me in the long run of the game, but if you want to do it, I definitely would see that being an option for you. If you're like foreseeing this being a very aggressive matchup, say it's game 2 or something, you could definitely argue for being more aggressive on that turn 2 for sure. But moving on, we're already in grade 3s. You ride your first grade 3, doesn't really matter what it is. It's Amaterasu, it's Tsukuyomi, it's Riley, it's whatever you want. It could be an Imperial Daughter, just for some advantage. You're not really pressuring your opponent on the first grade 3 ride as an Oracle Think Tank player, unless you're playing like White Hair Venaba and you're trying to like ramp into like something crazy with Tsukuyomi. I don't really see that being a pressuring turn for you. On Kagero's side, you could ride the end or regular Overlord first. It's kind of your best 2 options. Overlord forcing your opponent to guard or just taking it and hoping that you don't get a crit or something is actually really cool. I would recommend that if you do ride Overlord, using the Soul Blast, gaining 10k, forcing the attack to be even more so guard from your opponent if they're trying to get a little greedy with it and don't have a PG, let's say, because you're going first. If you are going first and you're riding the end and you want to be really aggressive and play your hand under 2 cards and then get forced to, by all means do so. I mentioned earlier how that's a very valid strategy strategy. On the other side though, once you ride into that Imperial Dotto, you definitely want to start just playing your cards. Play out your Promise Dotters, play out your Rectangle Magus, play out your Maiden Libra, play out your backup rear guards as Tsukuyomi, whatever those cards might be, and try and get whatever you're trying to do going. Try and pressure your opponent with crits or plus 10k or whatever to the front row. Do those things, and then try and do it again the next turn, and then the next turn, and pressure more cards out of your opponent's hand. That's kind of how this matchup goes on, is what I'm doing forcing enough out of my opponent's hand to the point where all that stuff they gained earlier, or are gaining right now, not worth it. And sometimes, if the answer is no, you're gonna lose. But then coming on to Overlord's side, this is the big turn for you. If you don't get like at least one Neo Flame down, plus an Overlord the Great on this turn on your second grade 3 ride, and start attacking with 5 rearguard attacks or 5 force attacks every single turn, you're not gonna win the game. If you don't do it on that first grade 3 ride, that's the most pinnacle turn for you, because that pushes your opponent from 3 to 4, or 4 to 5, or 3 to 5. You know, that turn, because they might not necessarily have used all their Counterblast the turn before, so they might not have had the most amazing plus turn ever. And also, you don't want to starve your opponent's Counterblast anymore from this point onward, because if you do, they would have so much resources saved up in their hand that there's no way you're going to break through it as the game goes on. So that's definitely my big recommendation, and the big like turning point in any game is if you do not get the Great on your second grade 3 ride as Kagero, you're not going to win. It just does not happen. I've never seen it happen, and it's honestly very scary. And then from there on out, it's whoever can achieve a win condition first. You know, it's can they get their deer, and if they do get their deer, did you save up for it, like having 2 BGs and then enough shield to stop it in case they get a double crit stack on your 4th damage? Did they whiff the double crit, you know? In BTO5 format, they'll have 12 crit in their deck, you know, so it'll be a lot scarier on those deer turns if they ever do still play deer, because they're gonna pretty much get 2 crits every single turn. Always make sure that you're counting your opponent's triggers. Always try and go for 2 to passes, you know, because you know that you have to save your PGs for the deer turn. So what I do a lot of the time is if they put a card back on top of the deck as an Imperial player and they attack with their Vanguard, I just go 2 to pass, and like they don't know what that second card is. They might know what the first card is, but they don't know. And sometimes they'll make misplays and they'll give it all their Vanguard and then they'll whiff. And then that's a really big deal, because now their rearguard attacks are less pressuring. I could take one or even stop him and then have 3 damage going into their deer turn. Which if you have 3 damage going into their deer turn, you're a freaking god and you're gonna kill them. I guarantee it. Like, you're not dying. So this matchup is a lot of give and take, a lot of getting lucky, to be honest with you. But I do ultimately think that in the summary of this matchup, the advantage goes to Oracle Think Tank and not to Kagero, because Oracle Think Tank is just more consistent, and the idea of this game is advantage, and their deck is literally just advantage the deck. So it's kind of hard to beat advantage the deck in an advantage matchup, right? So I think the final verdict is like 60-40 in Oracle Think Tank's favor, but with all the things that I've said, being aggressive when being aggressive matters, guarding trying to be lucky, and then guarding when it's worth it, is a really big deal on both sides of this matchup. And if I will say, if both players are not playing the matchup perfectly, an Oracle Think Tank player could easily throw the matchup. You know, like, it's not a for sure victory. They're not autopilot. You know, they gotta really think, okay, let's make sure I don't play this card so that way they get more advantage off of Berserk Dragon. Let's make sure that when they do retire stuff, they retire stuff that's useless. Make sure that when I stack stuff, I stack the right triggers and not the wrong triggers. If an Oracle Think Tank player misuses their resources even once and like whiff an effect or something that they needed to win the game, oh god, you can easily steal the game as Kagero. But the final verdict here, and the kind of summary that I'm going to make sure that I leave you guys with here, is that while you're playing this matchup, make sure you have these 2 things in your head. How many cards have I gained this game, and how many cards have I taken away from them? If this is more than this, that's bad. If this is more than this, that's good, right? Those are the 2 things here. You want to gain cards, sure, but the real key to winning this matchup is taking cards away from your opponent. So being a little more aggressive than maybe you would be in any other matchup is probably the best way to try to win. Alright guys, that does it for my episode 2 of Know Your Matchups, Oracle Think Tank versus Kagero. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you have any lingering questions about this matchup that maybe I didn't answer in this video, don't be afraid to ask them down in the comments below. Or better yet, come into my Twitch channel where I go live every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoon Pacific Standard Time, and ask me questions live and in person. I love talking about Cardfight Vanguard. I love talking with all of you guys, and honestly, I would just love to have you guys in there. Links to my Twitch down in the description below. Don't be afraid to check me out if you haven't already. Also, join our Discord server and ask questions in the Know Your Matchups Discord chat. Like I said, who knows? Maybe the question you ask could be a brand new video here on this channel. But anyway, guys, that does it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Always remember to work hard, rest easy, and live well. And I'll see you all next time. Peace out.